Hi, everybody. My name is Monica Dangler. I joined Awesome Pets Alive in 2015. I've been the volunteer manager since. Volunteers at Awesome Pets Alive, just so you know, make a huge impact on what we're able to do. Our organization has about 2,400 to 3,000 hour recording volunteers every year. About 800 of those volunteers are going to be our core everyday volunteers. The others might be seasonal or provide a little bit less commitment to us. I'm super excited to have you guys here to talk about our volunteer program. I hope that you guys will learn all kinds of great stuff that you can take back to your communities and help implement. I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Jerry.
Thank you.
And go from there.
Okay. Hi. I'm Jerry Kapler. I was looking this up because people always ask me and I always forget. This fall, I will have been with APA for 10 years. So I joined a couple years after it started. I've done fostering, donating. I'm on the board. When I started, I actually co-started the Adopt Line. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. It's basically our email customer care center. We help connect adopters with foster animals and answer general questions, and we get quite a ton of influx there, and it's just an easy way to get a hold of APA. After that, I, as a volunteer, created kind of a central volunteer coordination program, because before that, volunteers would come in, go through orientation, and then would just kind of get funneled into their area of interest with the team leads. But we did not have a centralized volunteer function, so that's kind of what we did. So you have done, the last 3 days, have listened to a ton of amazing programs that hopefully you're excited to implement or grow in your own organizations, and you're probably thinking, how the heck am I going to be able to actually do that without spending a fortune? And the answer really is volunteers. So we want to talk about how APA has leveraged that and what we have learned. So what we want to talk about is how and why they are a critical component of our organization, why recruiting, engagement, and retention of volunteers has evolved as the organization has evolved, and why we continue to try to focus on it and reinvent it. And finally, what role data has played in helping us grow and manage our volunteers. So, why are volunteers critical? Obviously, they're free help. So last year, we had over 2,100 volunteers log 145,000 hours. That's the equivalent of 70 full-time people, or $3 million in savings. So the numbers kind of speak for themselves. But apart from the free labor, we actually can get a lot more out of volunteers. Namely, they provide leadership. Most of our programs started with volunteers leading. Expertise, they come from all sorts of backgrounds and bring all sorts of skill sets that we could never afford to hire. They bring innovative ideas. Again, a lot of the programs that we have started and grown have come through volunteer ideas. And finally, networking. They bring their friends, their coworkers, their families, and put the word out about us. They can cross over into being fosters and donors and some of our biggest advocates politically and socially. So it's just a resource that you cannot pass up. All right, so the trust factor. So here's what I usually hear from people that are reluctant to use volunteers. If we get volunteers, how do we know they're going to show up? Or if they do show up, how do we know they're not going to just take over? So I think the key has been that we try to provide training and guidelines so that they kind of know what the expectations are, and they have the tools and the knowledge needed to make a difference. Because to be their most productive and effective, they have to feel like they have impact in the organization, and they need freedom and some initiative in order to do that. So it's kind of a mutual trust thing. You have to trust them enough to give them enough of a rope to make the difference, and and just kind of go for it. And they have certainly proved themselves at APA. So here's how we got started. Like I said, back in 2008, 100% volunteer, 0 staff. Our executive director, Ellen, didn't even draw a salary for 2 years. We hired some of our adoption dog counselor before we ever paid for leadership. Programs and the volunteers grew organically, and what I mean by that is we targeted kind of the easier animals on the euthanasia list at first, and we had a few volunteers that would help us with that. That happened to be that we started off-site adoptions to kind of try and get more eyes in front of animals that were perfectly adoptable. So those were volunteer run, and as those sites grew and those events grew and word got out about them, more volunteers started showing up wanting to be part of that solution. As more volunteers showed up, we were able to branch out into other areas of life-saving. And as we branched out into other areas of life-saving, more people heard about it, got excited, and showed up. So the two were just feeding off of each other. And we were not able to hire anyone until 2015, where we were lucky enough to find Monica. And until then, it was all volunteer efforts to run the volunteer organization. All right, so as you can imagine, since it was all volunteers, that means all functions, all handling all levels, whether it was in the clinic or doing the adoption, customer care, HR, legal, whatever. If a volunteer had the correct background and qualifications, they took over that spot in the organization. So it wasn't so much that we were hesitant and just were huge proponents of volunteers, although they are amazing. It's just that we had no money to afford anything else, so it just kind of worked out. So data in the early days, everything was shoestring, so we used all the free tools. When volunteers came and did orientation, we stored all their information in Zoho, which is a database program. So all their contact information, any area of interest that they expressed, we would house it there. And what would happen is they'd come in for orientation, they would say, hey, I'm really interested in feeding neonatal kittens. So we would take their email, forward it to the manager in charge of neonatal, and they would then take it from there. From there, the managers kind of were in charge of managing their own volunteer mini databases. That could have been everything from Yahoo Mail or Yahoo Groups, Google Mail, Google Groups, Excel spreadsheets, a notepad in somebody's drawer. Literally, it was anything that worked for that manager, which within the groups was effective enough. Unfortunately, if as an organization we were trying to pull like total hours volunteered, a lot of times you need to have that to apply for grants. Or if we wanted to gauge, what percentage of people that are coming in for orientation, are we actually engaging well in the organization? If we needed to get in touch with a subset of our volunteer organization that wasn't necessarily in a specific group, then it became just a logistical nightmare. So. In 2014, we bit the bullet and went with Better Impact, which is one of the many management tools for volunteers that are available out there. We chose it because it seemed to have most of what we needed. We pay about $2,200 a year to have 25 active licenses, so less than $1 a year per volunteer, which if you have the money is great. Again, we waited a long time to purchase it. But it does provide a ton of good information and makes managing volunteers a lot easier. You can track volunteer hours very easily. We have volunteers that show up on site, log in, the hours start tracking, and then when they leave, they log out, and we know what they were doing, who they were, and how long they were there. They can also do so on their cell phone, and they can do it from home on their computer if they are working from home. We have lots of volunteers that help with marketing or customer care or behind the scenes that work from home. We can track volunteer qualifications. So all of our levels of dog handling, for example, if I wanted to email all of the silver handle volunteers for dogs, or more likely if Monica wanted to, she'd be able to do that with a few clicks, which makes contacting the correct subset of your volunteers just so much easier. We can schedule shifts, which is critical for groups like the neonatal feeding team or the parvo ward, where you have shifts and you need people to commit to come in. So again, if you're trying to figure out how do we make volunteers accountable and dependable, that is one way. If a person signs up for a shift, it's shown that they are much, much more likely to show up. So that's a great tool. And finally, Better Impact is now offering e-learning. So we used to do a couple volunteer orientations a month, a couple hundred people a month would come in, go through orientation on a Sunday morning. And now we have orientation videos on our website, which means that they can do it on their own time and then schedule to come in to get the tour and meet Monica, and it's just a lot more flexible that way. So that is, if you're to that point and you can afford it, it's a valuable resource to go that route. So over the last 10 years of the organization, 11 years, APA has experienced phenomenal growth. So last year we saved 10,000 animals. You need infrastructure to do that. What we saw happening throughout the years is as spots opened up, as a volunteer left. So one thing I will say, volunteers have the challenge that this is not their job. So they have work that they have prioritized, they have families, things change. You're gonna get higher turnover typically in volunteers. So one of the ways that you mitigate that is you have training and a constant flow of volunteers that can step into, ideally, a position that you have very well documented. So if a volunteer has to leave for whatever reason, another volunteer can relatively easily step into that slot without sucking up a ton of management and training time, because you have the manuals and you have the procedures and you have hopefully other volunteers that can train them. But as APA grew exponentially, managers, be they volunteer or staff, did not have the time, usually, to set all that up and be really good and diligent about keeping track of it. So if we ended up having extra money, a lot of times managers would prefer to hire full-time staff people versus try and keep up with volunteer turnover. And so over time, we hired staff, so now we have a couple hundred staff on the payroll, full and part-time. What ended up happening as we did that is a lot of volunteers that used to have a senior role in the organization fell out of the organization, and other volunteers started feeling disconnected. And that was through no overall vision of ours. That just kind of happened because of the fact that most people were overtaxed just trying to take care of the animal load. But what we want to do now, what we've realized, is that we've kind of gotten away from our roots of really utilizing volunteers as much as we could. So we have started actually an organization-wide overhaul, not just the volunteer program, but across the board. We want to work on infrastructure and documentation and policies and procedures so that just the entire organization is in a better spot as far as training new leaders and dealing with turnover and creating a better environment. So volunteer overhaul specifically is designed to increase the retention, participation, and satisfaction of volunteers. And in order to do that, we're trying to bulk up procedures, policies, and expectations. We have brought in a ton of volunteers to help us with this. This is not a staff-only exercise. We have volunteers bringing in their feedback and their ideas as well, because what we want to do is go back to reintegrating volunteers at all levels and really maximizing everything that they can bring to the organization. So we're still very volunteer heavy. We just would like to utilize them even more. So I think that kind of wraps up my section. Monica is going to talk about the actual nitty-gritty of the overhaul. Okay. Bonnie.
Hello. Yes, so volunteer overhaul, how we got started. We wish we had this giant room full of a whiteboard. We would have used all of it and then more, probably a couple rooms like this. We unfortunately had to keep erasing them and taking pictures of whiteboards. Getting started was not an easy process. We spent about 4 months analyzing what our needs were. And when I say we, it was myself, Jerry, Ellen, our executive director, and Stephanie, our life-saving operation director. First, we had to figure out what we needed to do. So we started looking at what other people were doing. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel if you don't need to. So we're looking at lots of different programs that were already established and documented out there. And we came across the Canadian Code of Volunteer Involvement. We picked that. It's a lot like the Points of Light series that you guys may have seen. But we picked that one because it most reflected what we really wanted out of our volunteers and our volunteer program, which was to fully integrate volunteers across the board, treat volunteers and staff as just people, and treat them equally, not giving volunteers special privileges that staff wouldn't be allowed to have, things like that. So the Canadian Code of Conduct, or Canadian Code of Volunteer Involvement, really kind of encapsulated that for us. It also had a really great audit tool function to it that helped us look through and analyze what we needed to look at. When we looked through that Canadian Code, the first thing we noticed that we were missing was a vision for our volunteers. How do we want to use volunteers in an organization that we've written down? We've all could tell you word for word how we want to use volunteers, how we use volunteers in APA, but we never wrote it down. And that really kind of is important so that we can all write it down, we can see it, we can read it, and as new people come into the organization, they can know the direction we're going, and we can all be on the same page. So again, the four of us sat down and just put that down on paper of what we wanted and what we expected. And this is what we came up with. APA's vision for volunteerism. We envision an organization where volunteers and staff, otherwise known as people, are integrated at all levels of the organization based on organizational needs, individual commitment level, aptitude, and aptitude to further the mission of the end of killing pets. In order to do this successfully with structure, APA commits to provide documented role descriptions and expectations, as well as provide support and oversight for all people, so together we can build for sustainability. APA is committed to nurturing and protecting a culture where all people embody the organization's core values: innovation, inclusivity, drive, resourcefulness, and respect. Like I said, this statement is super important so we can all be on the same page and make sure we're all going the same direction. Just like your organization's mission statement is important, it's important you do this for your volunteers. So if you don't have a vision statement, I challenge you to go back, work with your board, with your executive director to create this vision for your program. So then we got down to actually assessing our volunteer program. The Canadian Code of Volunteer Involvement broke down everything into 12 categories, 12 standards. So these are those 12 standards. As you can tell, there's a whole lot of those. On that really awesome audit tool I was telling you about, they take each of these standards, and then they have a series of questions under each one of those that you can look through and answer, yes, this is something we're doing, this is something we would like to do, this is something we need to do. So basically we spent 4 months meeting 2 hours a week, going through each of these things and figuring out where our holes were and where we wanted to start. Those first 4 or 5 things are all going to be really directed towards things your board of directors are doing, your executive leadership's doing. It was things we already had implemented, and it was nice and solid, so we really didn't need to make much work on that. However, when we did our audit, we saw probably the biggest hole, or where we could make the biggest impact first, was with the orientation and training. Your orientation and training, your onboarding process, is the most important piece to bringing your volunteers into your organization. If you're not giving them the correct information, you're not setting them up for success, then you're not going to be successful, and they're not going to be able to help you the way you need them to. So that's why we went ahead and started with the orientation and training piece. Looking at that, we went ahead, and the next step to working with the orientation and training was to start forming committees. Jerry and I can all day long make up rules and pass those out to people, but if there's not volunteer buy-in, then it's really just kind of us spinning our wheels. So creating these committees was a great way to make sure we're getting all the information we need from volunteers, get their buy-in, and make sure we're heading in the right direction. I might really think volunteers need something, and they actually like, we don't need that, why are you telling us that? So if I have a committee of them, that's gonna help us out. So the committee work we started with the volunteer resource committees to help us with the onboarding and training of volunteers as they enter our organization. Of those committees, we kind of end up breaking that down into 2 more committees. We have our matching committee, and then we had our onboarding and training pieces. And we're going to talk more about what those things are in a little bit. Oops. Like I said, we want to make sure we're setting our volunteers up for success. The volunteer team is the mama bird. Volunteers are the baby bird. We don't want our baby birds looking like that guy coming out of the nest. We want to make sure we're giving them plenty of tools. And 2 of the tools we identified that volunteers were going to need in order to be successful with our organization was being matched through our matching team and through jump starts. Our matching team interacts with the volunteers as soon as they finish their application. On the application, we're going to gather a bunch of information from them and then suggest to them the most needed activities that best fit their needs. And we'll talk more about matching here in a little bit. And then they move into the orientation piece. And then finally, we want to be engaging those volunteers and engaging them in our mission and what we need before we pass them into their programs. And that's where our jump starts come in. Our jump starts are going to be activities. Some of you guys probably do this already. They're going to be activities that are our essential shelter task items. It's doing laundry, it's cleaning cat carriers, it's feeding the dogs, all those things we really need to get done. We're going to have them do 3 of those before they move into their programs. Those activities are going to be guided by one of the volunteer team members. So I'm going to meet a new volunteer. What most needs to be done is laundry today. I'm going to show them how to do it. It also gives me a chance to talk to them and learn about what they're wanting to do. It gives them 3 more chances after tour to ask me questions. Ultimately, after people leave orientation or their tour, that's when they think of everything is when they're at home. So it gives them 3 more times to think of questions to come back and ask those, and somebody there to answer those questions for them. That's helping them set them up for success. It's helping our organization meet our most basic needs. Those things like laundry and scooping poop and things like that are the things that most people don't want to do, or they're just tasks that aren't getting done. So we want to make sure we're directing volunteers to that place to do that. It's going to help them understand what our needs actually are. Once we get them in, we've got 3 stages of our onboarding process. Onboarding, I describe that as from the time they apply with us until the time they're ready to be passed off to their specific program. So the first stage is going to be their application stage. When there's some information we need to get from volunteers when they apply to us. We need to know first, how often do they want to volunteer? By finding that information out, we find out a whole lot of information. We've always asked that information. It was just recently that I actually looked at that information. When I started looking at how often volunteers want to volunteer with us, I noticed that everybody said 8 to 10 hours. And I was like, that's amazing. Why don't everybody volunteer 8 to 10 hours a month? And then I looked, and that was the lowest choice that they could do. So of course they were doing that. I was like, oh, no wonder. So we went ahead and updated that, right? We changed it to less than monthly, 2 times a month, weekly up to 1 hour, weekly 2 hours, weekly 3 hours or more. That's kind of the groupings that we figured out our activities kind of fall in. And then when we started looking at that data, we found out 75% of our volunteers want to volunteer less than weekly. So that's a pretty big thing. about 10 of our activities out of several hundred qualified for that. So that's a pretty big miss. If we have 3,000 new volunteers coming in a year and we have 10 activities for them to do, that's not going to work so well. So when we found out how often they wanted to come in, that helped us identify a problem. So then we started looking at our activities. Do all of those activities really need you to come in 2 hours a week? Do they really need 3 hours a week or whatever it is? And when we looked at it, no. There was a whole bunch of activities that could be done less than weekly. Basically, we kind of discerned those based on how much training was needed. If you could read a one-pager and then be proficient at that activity, then great. That would be something that you don't need to do weekly. If it's something you get an hour training and then never see that hour training again, could you do that still regularly? Great, then that's an activity. So we ended up expanding that base, which is great to help those incoming volunteers. The other thing we found out is once they started volunteering with us, those people who said they only wanted to come in once a month were like, oh no, I do want to come in weekly for 3 hours. I just didn't realize I needed to do that to do parvo puppies, but yes, I want to do that. And I found out how awesome you guys are. So definitely find out how often they want to come in. The other thing you need to find out is when do they want to volunteer. They might want to volunteer when you don't need a volunteer. Potentially there's an activity that you can point them to. Potentially you might need to redirect them somewhere else. The final thing we want to do is we want to find out is what do they want to do when they volunteer. When we're matching volunteers, this is a mutually beneficial thing. This isn't us matching them hoping they go away. This is making sure we're meeting what they want to do as well as meeting our needs. Doing this is super helpful. When I'm giving tours or starting a jumpstart and I say, hey, what do you want to do at APA? The most common response is, whatever you need me to do. What do you need me to do? So by finding out what they want and then telling them, giving them that direction is super helpful for them. And again, it's going to help you meet all your needs. So taking all this information, we can start seeing gaps. When we ask them when they want to volunteer, I can look at and go, oh, nobody ever says they want to volunteer Friday night. I need to start finding people that want to volunteer Friday night. So I can, again, meet all of our needs all the time, not just some of the times. How we're going to measure, we're going to continually compare those numbers. How many people are applying, comparing that to how many people are going through orientation, to how many people are doing jump starts, where are our drop-offs, where are our gaps, and then sending surveys to those people. Hey, I noticed you applied and you didn't go through. What's going on? Give them some easy choices. Don't make it an open form. Give them 5 choices to pick from. So you can find out, oh, you applied and you just weren't ready. You weren't planning on volunteering for 4 more months. Great, amazing. Let me know when you're ready to come back. But that helps you identify those gaps and see what you can adjust. Are we making it too hard? Do they not know what the next steps are? So yeah, all that good stuff. So that's how we're going to measure that. After our application stage, and they're matched, they're going to go onto the orientation stage. There's 3 big things that a lot of us tend to make mistakes doing with our orientation piece. The first one is we don't make it easy or convenient. Make your orientation easy and convenient. Most of the time it's not on purpose that we're making it hard, but we have time constraints, we have space constraints, we have staff constraints. Jerry talked about our online orientation. Everybody can do an online orientation. That makes it easy for them to do it. It makes your messaging consistent also, which is great. And it also gives you a nice steady flow of volunteers coming in all the time as opposed to these big bursts of volunteers coming through. So just make it easy and convenient. Finally, don't overwhelm your volunteers. We like to because it probably, in most cases, it's the first and last time we're going to talk to them is at orientation. So we're trying to tell them everything they could possibly ever know during the time that they would be with you. Don't make 3 and 4 hour orientations. Make it simple. Don't overwhelm them. Your orientation should be focused on general things. What's your mission? Why do they want to volunteer here? How are they making an impact with the organization? Basic expectations, what they can expect from us, what we're going to expect from them. What are some basic programs? You don't need to go into detail about the dog program. Just, we got dog walking. Keep it nice and general. Those details that you need, put those into your volunteer handbook. Put those into some other written documents so they have those they can reference later. And then finally, break it down if you need to. APA is a pretty large organization. Some of you guys might have large organizations where we have lots of information we need to give people. We don't want to do it all at once. Take that training material, put it in a dog training or a cat training. Do not give your dog and cat handling training in orientation. Do that separate. We have so much information. We have get to know APA. So there's that mission. It's almost selling them on why they want to volunteer at Austin Pets Alive. So give them that information first. And then once they've bit the hook, then go ahead and do the actual general orientation, where you're giving them expectations of volunteers, any general rules that every single volunteer should know when walking around your facility. Try to keep it at an hour. Nobody pays attention after an hour, so try to keep it that, break it down as you need to. And then the final stage is engagement. At this point, our volunteer team, we should have nurtured our baby birds and shoved them out, and hopefully, I think those guys are flying. So hopefully they're gonna fly out of the nest and not fall to the ground. That was the closest to baby birds flying I could find. So hopefully they're going out. A big piece of engaging our volunteers is gonna be interacting with them, and that's where that jumpstart piece comes in. Like I said, it's giving us time to talk to them, have them ask questions, show them the basic things we need done. Then when they go onto dogs or cats, they know where to find litter pans, they know where to find linens and towels, and they're able to be helpful. That's a great way to get them started and get them to buy into why they want to volunteer in your organization, and then move into those programs. Ultimately, why they're feeding dogs, they see this dog that's their favorite dog ever, and now they want to walk dogs. They see cats, why they're doing crate cleaning, and now they want to volunteer with cats. So help them get involved. Those jump starts are great for everybody, even those people who are not going to volunteer at your main facility. We have volunteers that volunteer at home, we have thrift stores, we have people who just do events, we have them all over the place. Everybody does the jump starts. Like I said, it's getting buy-in into the mission so they understand where you're going, they understand what your biggest needs are. And ultimately, we all have those emergencies with all hands on deck, whether it's you take in a hoarding situation, something's catching on fire or flooding or whatever's happening, and you're like, we need volunteers now. If everybody shows up and most of them don't know where the laundry room is, it's not very helpful. But if they all know where the laundry room is, where to find bowls, where to find crates, that's super helpful. You can be like, cool, just go back and get some crates, go get some laundry. That's going to help you out in those times of crisis and keep them engaged in your organization. Finally, what do we have left to do? A whole lot. We just touched on that one orientation and training piece. There's still all those other pieces that we didn't, stages we didn't touch on yet, the supervision, how to review, how to do all kinds of different things, recognition, retention, all of those things. So we still have lots to do. We started those committees with the volunteer resources team. We're just now, it's been almost 6 months, we're just now starting to work on some of our bigger programs. And again, we're not just working on how to walk dogs, but in the dog program, all of the onboarding for the dog program, all of the onboarding for the cat program. Your onboarding isn't just about the organization, but it's about each team too. So now we're working on how do we train them? How do we make sure we have the documents for them that they need? How do we set them up for success? So when they start walking those dogs, they know how to do it right. When they start volunteering with the cats, they know exactly what they need to do. They know how to handle them safely. So we still have all of that left to do. This volunteer overhaul / organization overhaul is not anything that's going to be done probably this year. I'm hoping the dogs are done by the end of this year.
I kind of picture it like when you're painting a big bridge and you're done, and then you go over and you start
You're like, let's start it again, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to be working on this for a while with the onboarding and the trainings, as well as putting in those performance metrics and really analyzing what's working and not working, putting out those surveys, looking at our data, making sure we're identifying those gaps. So we've got a whole lot of work to do, but it's great. I definitely encourage you guys, the one big takeaway is don't ever assume your program, don't get stagnant in your program. Don't be like, yeah, we got a volunteer program, it's good. You can always make things better. Everything can always improve. No one's perfect. No one has the best volunteer program out there. So always be willing to look and see what's not working, what's changed, and make those small tweaks or maybe big tweaks to keep your volunteer organization or your volunteer program fresh and continuing to move along with your organization. I believe that's it. Do you guys have any questions? Thank you.